Hello and welcome, my name is Trismegistus, and today we're going to be reading through and biting into the latest Factorio Friday Facts. Friday Facts 445, The Biters Bite Back. Posted by Clonan. Hello, we have another dose of human-generated facts for you. I was planning to write about these biter and enemy behaviour changes before the 2.1 release, but an unfortunately timed neck injury led to it being postponed. The silver lining here is that now I can write about all the player reactions and funny bugs we found along the way. So yes, in case it wasn't obvious, this is about the biters. One thing that I kind of discovered is that, and I'm going to do a poll to see whether you guys are like this, but a lot of people, like a large proportion, play without combat, which is why clones are going on to say what it's about to say. But I was quite surprised at the proportions of people who don't have biters on, basically, and even if they do, they'll turn the combat side of it off, so they're passive. But just for context, I do play with the biters on. I play with them on aggressive and what have you, not to the extent of Death World, just normal sort of settings, but yeah, so I enjoy the combat in the game. If you don't, and this really isn't for you, then fine, sort of thing, but it might be just to give some interesting context. You might want to see what it's all about. We might be getting into controversial territory here, but I like the biters and I like fighting them. I like clearing nests when expanding. I especially like defending against them when they smell my success. However, I never had fun with the expansion groups. The whole feature just didn't seem to land right, and I would like to know if many other players agree. So let's delve right in. Enemy Expansion Planner. The Enemy Expansion Planner is one of those systems that has been around for a very long time, since 2013. And while it has had its improvements and fixes over time, it never really received a holistic review of how it was working in the modern context of the game. So I guess one of the context on this is that when they did 2.0, they made it so that biter nests become tougher as the evolution level increases. This was, an introduction to make it kind of scaled more towards the player. The assumption being that if they've evolved, it's mostly through pollution and you killing them, and therefore your military side of things should have got better. Essentially, you should have done military researches, etc. Therefore, it kind of scales a bit with the player's military capability. Expansion groups were too small, making for weak, ineffective expansions. While we tuned and balanced the map generation to make the nests a challenge, the expansion planner only ever sent small sorties to expand. I mean, that title kind of says it all. It basically hits the nail on the head, really, and say this is what it's about to talk about, and you can already see in the big picture there that the expansion groups were just tiny, and they've always been tiny, and even as the game got further along, they would remain tiny, and so it was just this continuous annoyance, basically, not an actual challenge. And here we see it. So the point that Clonan is really getting to is that when it makes the map, it puts in these big nests. You get these big nests. Now, it does it in a kind of expanding from where you start, so the 0-0 start point of the game where you are. And as you go out, these groups that it builds at, when it generates the terrain, are bigger and bigger. So the further away from that origin point, those initial nests are bigger as you get further away, up to a point where they reach a sort of maximum, and then they're all usually about that sort of size. As you reveal more of the map, it generates the nest. The nests aren't predetermined, other than it's a deterministic thing, so that if you do the maths, then you would get these numbers type of thing. But they don't exist in a sense until you actually reveal the map chunks. It actually does it a little bit into the fog of war, so they're ready to go, as it were. But that algorithm, that process for making those groups would end up not too far from the map with fairly big expansions, as it's fairly big settlements, as it were, as it's showing here. If you've not seen my lore video, that expanding wave, I've kind of explained in my headcanon lore that basically, because my idea is that the biters are not indigenous to Nauvis, and that it's the engineers, not just our engineer, but them as a species sort of thing, as a people, that have seeded them onto Nowvis. And you can watch my video, plug, for the detail of kind of why on Prometheum science and stuff. But basically my idea was that the reason it's like, depopulated where you are is that they were harvesting the nests. So the idea is that, or my idea is that area is where they pulled up all these nests in order to get the eggs. You remember you use them in Prometheum science, but they're like pulling up these nests in order to get the eggs and stuff. And so it's, that they've depopulated that area basically, so that it then takes off. Something happens. In my headcanon, the biters get loose, attack the rest of the crew, just leaving the engineer, but the ship crashes, and that's where we start. That kills anyone, engineer that's left, that isn't the player, but also the onboard biters. But that's why it's, there's nothing there, basically, is my headcanon. So I think that's explainable, that expansion thing, because it is a bit weird when you think about it. Why is it just where we are, where there's no biters? The bad thing then, the thing it would do is that it would generate these expansion groups. We'll talk about how it does that later on, but it would generate create these groups that it wanted to expand to build new nests. And look, they're tiny. It's like, because each of these is created from a biter, so that's 2, 4, 6, 7, and that one's 2, 4, 5, and that one's 2, 4, 6, 7, and that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 2, 4, 6. You see, it's all in that very, not even 10 biters doing the expansion. And so when they go out, you've got a nest, this is coming from here, and that's all it's creating. It's just one party goes out, creates that. And there's 30 in there or something? And maybe more in there, 35 or so. So these big origin points produce very small expansion, and it doesn't change throughout the game. So, it makes no sense. It's not that it makes no sense. It's not, there's no challenge to it. They're just pathetic, basically, and annoying, which is what Clonan goes on to say. Small expansion nests do not really create a challenge. They just annoy the player and create busy work. It would feel much more compelling and meaningful to have one large expansion nest rather than 10 tiny ones, so I decided to move in that direction. 1. Increase group size with evolution factor. 2. Modify group size dependent on the map generator biter base size. So, increasing group size with evolution factor, so that then ties in with the biters get tougher as they get more evolved. Great. The point about the challenge and what sort of, all that sort of stuff is where you may disagree. I say that whole creating a challenge, annoying the player, busy work, a lot of people may well have thought that was fine, and exactly as, they liked that, as it were. I always felt it was just busy work. It was just annoying, 5 biters spawn. It takes seconds to kill them off, but you got to go there, you got to kill them off, you got to come back. But also, it led to a bit of a. I like building the defences. That my get most fun in the game from designing stuff, and that includes designing the defences. And so I would do a lot of work designing defences and putting them down and stuff like that. And then all that would turn up would be 4 biters, and it's like, this is so pathetic. It's not worth bothering with. And you can make the argument, well, play on a death world then, and what have you. But the default version of it shouldn't be annoying. The default version should be fun, with that caveat that you may not find the combat fun. The second point there, the modified group size dependent on the map generator biter base size. So that's what I was talking about before. When it generates that map, those biters nests on the map, so if you set it to a death world, then that, you can actually do the sliders properly, but, thinking of death world as a setting, that is a modifier you can do. So you can have those nests, that it generate when it does map generation, make them bigger or smaller. And so the idea was that, like this, basically, if you've got a nest size that big and that's generating biters to go and colonize, it should be about the same size, because each of those nests, not necessarily the worms, obviously, but each of those nests should produce 1 or 2 biters. So it should be something much more similar to where it came from. That makes sense. The goal with the changes is that at any point in the game, an expansion party will be sized to present a good challenge at your current technology level. Another guiding principle was to try to get the expansion nests to match the existing ones, so that you can't tell which were from the map generation and which were from the expansions. So yeah, if it's a behavioural thing that the biters do, they create these nests of this size, and that's shown on the map, why then would they create smaller expansions to do that colonisation? They would create the same sorts of sizes, wouldn't they? It sort of makes logical sense. And as I say, my headcanon of why it's thin around where you are is because you've removed them, basically. You've killed them off. The numbers in the initial 2.10 release seemed a bit too strong. So in 2.1.13, I have tuned back the numbers. So this was actually something I mentioned when I was in the closed beta before it came out and went sort of public, was that what actually happened is I went, it was about 3 hours in, I think, something like that, 3 or 4 hours, and I went for an explore basically to find some choke points to cut off sort of thing. And I ran across a group of biters doing an expansion. And I sat there for, well, you see why in a minute, but I sat there for sort of, whatever it was, 10 minutes or something. And they were just, new worms forming and nests and worms and nests and worms and nests and worms. And this was only 4 hours into the game. So the expansion, the evolution was only 0.2 or something. And so it was just nuts, basically. There was just this massive expansion. And it was really close to my base as well. Not quite on the doorstep, but as I say, it was a short drive away type of thing. I was well ahead of the curve sort of thing, but my comment was basically if someone's not quite that aggressive on, getting poison capsules and what have you, that's going to be difficult for them to take on, and it might annoy a few people. So yeah, it seems like eventually they sort of scaled it back. So these two charts, they're actually interactive basically, and it just have a note saying, for those wondering, a graph in 2.0 would be a straight line from 5 to 20. What it means by that is, you see these numbers here, this is the size of the group of biters that go and expand, and so that 0% with a minimum group size of 5 and a maximum group size of 20, that never changes. So as evolution goes up, it stays as a group between 5 and 20. Now what these two charts are showing, this is what was in, that was basically what was released, 2.10 expansion size versus evolution factor. And this is what it was. So 2.13 is like the previous version to the one that came out today, basically. This is obviously in the experimental version. You need to enable that to play on this. And this is what it is now. So 2.1.13 rather, expansion size versus evolution factor. The initial thing was it started with that 5 to 20. That was its baseline, 0 evolution. As they evolved, the minimum group size eventually got up to, not that you can ever actually, I think, reach evolution factor 1, but got up to 20, and the maximum went from 20 up to 80. Okay, so as you get up into these top levels, that's a nice big chunky group of biters to contend with. The point being that at that point, especially if you're playing Space Age, you've got rocket turrets, you've got the Tesla turret, you've got, I guess maybe, well, you wouldn't really be using railguns on Nalvis, you'd blow up your own defences, but you've got those two as extra weapons. You've also leveled up all of your gun damage, your laser damage, your explosive damage, all of that stuff. You've done that predominantly just for your platforms to survive, so you've kind of got to do it. So having the biters or the expansions go up in association with the evolution factor makes a lot of sense. As you can see, though, it starts pretty wide, so it's pretty a wide variability, and just gets wider as it goes up. So you go from a sort of range of 15, more biters per expansion potentially, to a range of 60 more per expansion. And it's obviously picking something between those two values at all evolution factors. What's happened is that the initial has been brought down and made tighter, so it's now a group between 5 and 10. For me personally, I say that's still a bit wimpy. I would have preferred it being maybe between 10 and 20 sort of thing, maybe. But, so you've got to account for a range of player interest levels, and the gap still increases, but it's much more of a gentle gap increase. We still end up with a maximum size of 80 though. The other thing that's interesting is that because the gap therefore doesn't sort of expand as much, it means that the minimum group size goes up quite a lot now. So at 100% evolution it was 20, but it's now 40. So at that point you are always getting a pretty meaty expansion party no matter what. 20's kind of rubbish, but 40's getting into the range of, that's something to have to consider. In short, the bases will start smaller, going from 20 down to 10, but scale to the same max size of 80. The game picks a random number between the min and max when dispatching an expansion group. You can also notice the variance between min and max was reduced in 2.1.13. There was also a bug causing the groups to settle a little bit too close to the factory walls, which I fixed for 2.1.13, so there should be less pressure in this regard. So yes, I did have something like that. At that stage, I didn't have Spidertrons on Alvis. I had the tech, but not the Spidertrons. But of course, you can remotely control tanks now, so I just drove a tank all the way up there and sorted them out, basically. But that's the other type. That's also the other type of thing, that because the expansions are more aggressive and it forces you to use more of the tools. So you may not have ever thought, you may have just had your walls, that was it. You didn't need to bother because they were never strong enough to deal with. But now if you're away on, Fulgora or whatever, you can remotely control a tank, and now it gives you a reason to be doing that because, they might come in with an 80 expansion wave and it takes out your defences and they punch a hole in it and then suddenly they're chewing on your mines or what have you, and so you've got to deal with it, and so you've got to remotely control the tank, where that maybe before that wasn't something you used to do. And of course now with 2.1 in fact, they've introduced patrol Spidertrons. You can set up a patrol group, so gives you some more tools to deal with it. And as it doesn't cover in this, I thought it might do, but it doesn't cover in this, that there are some improvements to like combat shotgun and stuff like that, so they're giving you more tools to deal with it. It's not just making it harder. Exploring early would nerf expansions. So nerf just means, it's not a term everyone knows, it just means to make worse, basically. So a nerf gun fires them soft, bullets, basically. So the idea being you take a proper gun and turn it into a nerf gun, then it's a soft that doesn't actually do any damage. This is one I didn't really know about, but it sort of makes sense. The expansion planner, time between expansions, didn't scale with the number of candidates. So if you had a lot of candidates somewhere far away, then you wouldn't get any expansions near your base. This led to an unfortunate inverse difficulty relationship. Players who explored around the map early would experience fewer expansions near their factory. Biter nests in explored territory would thicken and become much denser than intended. If you're not aware, the game, obviously the game is tile-based, everything is a square, but they group those tiles up into, I can never remember the number, but a certain number of tiles becomes what they call a chunk, basically. So I think it's 32, I can never remember the number. Basically, if you imagine a bigger square made up of those smaller squares, then that's a chunk. These circles are the chunks, okay? So I know it's a circle and I'm talking about squares, but it considers them, this is the chunk, as it were. And what the expansion planner does, because the expansion planner is scanning the map saying, where can I send an expansion group? And what it does is it assesses each chunk based on a bunch of criteria. Okay, this is when it starts talking about heuristics, this is what's going on. Now, obviously, if there's already some biters there, as you can see on some of these, it considers that do not settle there. There used to be a thing that one of the things it would consider was whether the player had built structures, because they didn't want to annoy you constantly by sending biters to places you'd already built, because it would just get a bit, it'd just get really annoying, sort of thing. They want, that surprise element of you drive across somewhere and suddenly and there's some biters there and they weren't there before. That's kind of part of the aim of what they're going for. Anyway, the point is that these green ones it's saying, yep, you can settle a new nest here. This is a candidate for expansion. There are actually shades to this, so it's like a weighting thing. So it's like, if it's like a very bright green, that's a higher candidate, and it becomes subtler. You can actually see the odd orange one in there. That's an orange one, and so it's a sort of a scale. So these are just 0. These are 1, and so there's then a bit of a scale between that. What they're going for is they want it to fill in the map, and it just becomes harder and harder and harder to clear areas for expansion. The problem that they're saying is that once and as I say, it doesn't generate like the nests or anything like that until you've uncovered it. So it does it slightly into the fog of war, but if you leave an area undiscovered, it doesn't generate anything in that undiscovered area. But that meant that if you uncovered a massive swathe of the map, then in that previous, if you didn't uncover it, so imagine half of this isn't shown, then the number of green circles is a lot smaller. Okay? And so the chances, because it's going through and it's randomly picking ones to do. And so effectively what you're saying is if you uncover a great big swathe of the map, it's now got lots and lots of places that it can say, send an expansion group there, send an expansion group there, send an expansion group there. And that can all be miles and miles and miles away from the player. And if you've uncovered like an enormous area of the map and you're never intending to go there, you've just... You've put a choke point there, a choke point there, a choke point there, you seal that off, then it's busy filling in these bits of the map that you've never any intention of going to. You have no desire to go to there. You might have done so many productivity researches that you don't need to go there. And so it's just busy merrily filling them in when it has no... It doesn't mean anything to the player, which is quite interesting, really. So the point would be, well, actually, let's make it so that it's a bit more focused on the player, that maybe it doesn't try and expand on top of him all the time, but that the expansions are relatively close or filling in areas where you've left a gap or something, and it gives that surprise element of, oh my god, there's biters there now and having to deal with it. But that also meant that if you did suddenly decide, maybe you explored this and you were like, oh, I'll put a pin in that iron patch, I'll go there. And then it's hours and hours and hours later, and you're like, oh, I need that iron now. I'll go and take a train up there. It's been busy filling that in, and so you've now got an area of the map that is just death world, basically. There was always this comment on Reddit and the forums and stuff that eventually every world becomes a death world because it fills in all of the gaps. And their point was, well, that's probably a bit unfair if you're just mildly interested in the combat, then turning every world into a death world beyond a certain distance is probably not really what we want to go for. So again, focus it a bit more on the player so that they have to deal with the expansion rather than making the rest of the map impossible. And obviously it's not impossible. You get nukes and you can just nuke the entire planet. But, the point remains. To solve this, I did a mostly fresh rewrite of the heuristics and penalties for the candidate chunks, trying to ensure that areas explored but otherwise untouched by the player wouldn't have an effect on the expansion behaviour. You can see the difference below. So heuristics is basically a way of making a decision, and generally speaking a quick way of making decisions. So as I mentioned before, there used to be a thing in the game where if you built a structure, then the game would just disregard that chunk. And that's a very quick and easy decision to make. Is there a player built structure in this chunk? Yes, ignore it or set it to 0 expansion chance. Nice, simple decision. Or what you need to achieve when you're doing that for like a game, and if it's a systemic game like Factorio, is that heuristic, that decision making in the code is very easy to understand, and a player can then exploit it. And what we all used to do is we would build... We had various names for them, but like freedom power poles, basically, where you would uncover a bit of the map, stick on a power pole, that would mark it as a player-built area or player-built chunk, and the game would then ignore it for expansion. So you would never have to really deal with expansion groups if you just ensured that every single chunk had one power. They didn't have to be connected. Just literally any structure built. You could build a single piece of wall, any of that stuff. And of course you could have the heuristic then go, what type of thing is built there? Is it an assembly machine? Then don't build it. If it's a power pole, then we can still build there. So you can, modify your heuristic, but obviously the more complicated that gets, the more complicated your code is for making a decision, greater the performance cost for making that decision. And of course, if you're trying to do every single chunk in the game like it used to, then you want something that's super, super, super simple, because you don't want to scan every single chunk. You can, of course, not bother doing the scan until leave it a minute or something between each scan, but you want something that's quick and dirty, basically. The new version of it, as you can see, it is not even kind of considering a lot of the chunks, or if it is considering them, it's not marking them, basically. So you'll notice some similarity to what it was before, in that we had a big area of green here, for example, and it's now saying, yeah, if you want to stick an expansion in, this is far enough away from all the other groups in order to be a candidate. I'm assuming, essentially, that the 0 marked ones that don't expand here is like how they're now representing no to the chunks, in the sense that they're not storing the no's, they're only marking the yeses. Because I'm interpreting these blank areas to mean they are effectively 0. So all these red bits are now just, if it has a null value, if it's nothing, then that means don't expand there. That's what I'm assuming that means. But essentially what it's saying is it's only marking the candidates for, look, there's a big clear area. Yeah, really big clear area. Not just, because look, that's an island, so it couldn't get there. But you've got lots and lots of tiny little green ones where it's not even bothering with those as potential expansion candidates. So in other words, it's not, if you uncover all of this map, then it's going to only pick a few places to stick them in and not just gradually fill in the entire map like a death world. And what it's doing instead, I'm assuming that the player is down here. If you look, these are smaller groups. So I'm assuming the player is off down in this direction. I can't see any buildings, but that's why it's picking these spots here, because you're merrily, working away here. A couple of expansion groups are going to come and try and set up on your doorstep, but mostly they're going to try and fill in areas that you're about to go to. And so it gives you a pressure as well, if you think about it, of saying, now you know that if you uncover this iron patch and don't pick it up, when you come back, it's probably going to have some biters on it. That's a good pressure mechanic, because it gives a bit of a decision for saying, because the biters fundamentally are a pressure mechanic. The whole point of them is to push you on, basically, do more combat research. But the point here is that if you uncover that patch, then that gives you look, you better go and claim that now and put some turrets on it, or what have you, otherwise you're going to have a problem later on. So it gives a bit more of a sort of organic pressure, I think. Or alternatively, clear them out and put a blockade against that one, sort of thing. So I think it's a good change, basically. Caption on that one just says expansion candidates before on the left versus after on the right. Greener equals higher probability. The result is that not only do we have significantly fewer candidate chunks, but that they are more relevantly placed close to open areas or areas the player has cleared before. Expansion should now feel more predictable as well. The timing and pressure should be more consistent. Another part of the rewrite was to untangle some subtle biter-related assumptions, which were causing problems with the pentapods on Gleba. Build base behavior. The expansion planner tells a group of biters when and where to go and build a base. But the actual building was carried out by a unit group with a build base command. Similar to the expansion planner, there were many subtle assumptions and hard-coded numbers throughout the logic, and the functional difference before and after is hard to explain. The most notable change is to the cooldown between building the entities. Beforehand, this was calculated as 5 ticks per hit point of built entity, which sounds nice but effectively made the biters act inconsistently and idle for a huge amount of time. Building a few worms could take over 20 minutes. It also again had an inverse difficulty curve, where late game nests would build significantly slower than weaker early game nests. Now the cooldown is static and is a number we can easily tune and adjust. For the initial 2.1 release, I had it set to 5 seconds, so you can see its relevance below. So we'll play the videos in a minute rather, or no, me in about half an hour. But I guess this is where I should explain, or try and explain what's going on before we watch the videos, because the videos I'm going to try and do both in parallel. It might be a bit of a trick shot, but yes. So the point is that this group of biters is an expansion group. Now, they've had a flag set for them in the code that says you are an expansion group. That's what you're doing, because you've got a separate type of one, if you remember from playing the game, where they respond to pollution. You have a pollution response type group. And functionally, when they're moving across the map, they are identical. You can't really tell the difference, other than that the pollution guys will head towards the pollution that they've been triggered on. There's also a combat response. So, if you lob some artillery out at a biter nest, they will form a clump and send that group in response. So, there are multiple different types of groups of biters moving across the map. The expansion guys, the previous algorithm, this heuristic, has said, go to this chunk. It's randomly picked this one and said, go to this chunk and expand. I don't actually know. I assume it does that based on this is the biter group, and it picks that as well. So it maybe picks that as the closest one and says, go here and expand. But it could do it more randomly than that. I don't know. But whatever that is, what happens is that set of biter nests creates has a group form of new biters. So it would take those biters, and you can actually watch them do it on the map. They sort of slowly, it's not that slow, but extra ones, get spawned and they go and stand in this group. Okay, and again, as I say, sometimes that'll be pollution response, and it looks exactly the same. But they go and stand in a big group, a big clump, and then they all head off at the site together. Now, the biters and the spitters have different walk speeds, but it's synchronized so that they all sort of move together as a big clump. When they arrive at the designated chunk, the game then starts making decisions about what to do with each biter, because the idea is that these biters turn into the expansion, essentially. So the biters, and it'll explain this later on, but the biters can turn into a worm, they can turn into a biter nest, or they can turn into a spitter nest. Now, obviously, the biter nests and spitter nests are fixed. Those are just one's red. The spitter one, I think, is red, and one's grey, sort of thing, and that's it. The worms, of course, can be different sizes. Small, medium, large, and behemoth worms. Basically, completely randomly picks which one it's going to do. And I say, it is going to explain a change that Plan tried to make, but I think it's just back to completely random. But it is weighted, particularly for the worms, but it's weighted for the biters as well, that they, as I say, this may have changed, but very early on, spitters don't exist in the game until a certain evolution level. I've talked about this in my lore theory as well, but there are no, spitters until a certain evolution level. You can have spitter spawners, but they don't start spawning spitters until that evolution level is reached. They spawn biters, the walking guys. So you could have a group, and it can be made, and what spawns in terms of the actual, when it's doing the evolution group, what spawns is just randomly generated, but it weights higher. The weighting is based on the evolution level, so you'll get, as it shows here, you've got quite a lot of big biters, but eventually you'll get behemoths, and what have you. Early on, you'll just get the small ones and the medium ones, and so that group is there. But it then randomly picks, so it's not, and say that you try to change it, but it's not based on what they are. So it's not that if you have a whole load of behemoth biters in an expansion group, they will become behemoth worms. They can randomly become small ones in theory, but at that point that weighting is so low that it's very unlikely. But they'll be like small, medium, large behemoth worms, and it's just random. And whether they become a nest or a worm, it's all just random. But of course the code and the game can't have them sat on top of each other, because that's not how it does them, basically. So what it does is it effectively runs through each biter and says, you're going to be a worm and you're going to be here. You're going to be a biter nest, you're going to be here. You're going to be a worm, you're going to be here. And so it's doing that as a process. It's not just they arrive, ping, they all suddenly become, biters and worm nests and worms and all that sort of stuff. It does it individually. But you can run across the groups doing the expansion and interrupt them, basically. And it's quite a fun mechanic. And so that's one of the reasons it does it, is that to give you that opportunity to interrupt them and see what's going on. But yes, so that's kind of how it works. Basically, the group is randomly picked. The size of the group, as we know, is now a different number system, different size based on evolution. But they arrive, and then it goes through each one, picking what to turn it into, and plopping down where to put it so that it doesn't overlap. Okay, so now we'll watch it through. I really explain that in some detail. Hopefully it makes sense. But the basic point is that initially there was no cooldown, so they would just ping, 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 ping. And then with 2.1, it was increased to a 5-second cooldown, which was then adjusted further. So I'll try and get these as close together as possible, because it's basically the same group. And as you can see, ping, 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 they're already settled, okay? Which, if you're driving along, there is no chance for you to interrupt this group. You'll also notice that some of them sometimes don't turn into nests and worms and stuff, but so effectively they have a sort of a defensive thing group as well. But sometimes it actually shows you it here. It immediately spawns one, or spawns them very quickly. So that's like the defense, because obviously if it turned into a whole bunch of stuff and you were there, then you could there wouldn't be anybody to defend it. So that's kind of what it's trying to do. But this 5-second cooldown, so it's effectively going through each one saying, what do you need to turn into? You need to turn into a spitter nest. Oh, you need to turn into a biter nest. So that's what it's doing, and it's saying where to do it, and that's why they wander off and plop down into that thing. Okay, so that's massively over-explained again. Welcome to my videos. 5 seconds between entities initially seemed fine, but after some playtesting and player feedback, I realised it was probably a bit on the quick side. It's also nice to be able to catch the biters in the act of expanding, which a longer cooldown would give further opportunity for. So, for 2.1.13, we have increased the cooldowns, 30 seconds by default and 10 seconds for Death World. These are the two. I just left these running because you've kind of seen, I've explained the mechanic of it happening. So on a Death World, 10 seconds in, so there we go, another one. I mean, I would probably have, I think 5 seconds would have been good for a Death World, because it's meant to be tough. And then we're 20 seconds in. Obviously it makes the decision, then the biter's got to travel to that point, so that's why it's not exactly 20 seconds. But 30 points, another decision is made, and it goes and sits there. So we should see at 37, 38, 39, whoops, 40, there you go, another decision made. You see, so it's doing it on a, where am I going to put it? What am I going to turn into? Okay, go and do it. Where am I going to put it? What are you going to turn into? Go there. Okay. And then the 30 seconds one, again, I still think this is a bit slow, but, oh, you see there, so we'd have to wait it's a minute, so we'll get 2 spawns. So let's move it across. So 20, yeah, there we go, a worm, and then a worm now. So that's basically what it's doing on each of the things. As with many tasks, the idea that if you do things right, people won't be sure you've done anything at all definitely applies here. The biter expansion groups should just act like you would have always thought they acted. A lot of weirder implementation details were not immediately apparent. Units define built entity. Modders may notice that now the entity being built by the unit is now defined by the unit itself. And it refers out to the 2.1 API doc. This allows much greater control and actual use of the build-based behaviour outside the specific base game context, and generally makes more sense than the prior system. So this is what I was talking about, where it used to just do it randomly, and Clonans tried to introduce a system where what the unit is defines or influences what it builds. As a celebration of this possibility, I used it to add a biological caste system to the biters, where biters become biter or spitter spawners, and spitters become worms. Makes sense, doesn't it? So if it's a spitter, you would expect that it buries itself in the ground, grows larger, becomes immobile, and becomes the defensive turret. So spitters are the only ones who have the ability to spit, so they become the worms. Biters, whatever the process is that they're actually undergoing in order to turn into a nest, some sort of transmogrification or molting or what have you, they then can genetically pick, whichever type that they are, and so that allows them to spawn one or the other type. Again, my video kind of talked about my theories on how the biology of the biters work. But the point being, makes sense, doesn't it? Spitters become worms, biters can become the nests, and that's it. I thought it was clever and great for some law or naturalistic perspectives. And soon a bug report came in. Oops, all worms. And this is the problem, basically, with that. Okay? Oops, all worms. In that the expansion group that happens is made entirely of worms. There's not a single nest in there, which, given that worms are completely immobile, they're never going to spawn a nest, so there won't be any spawning going on. And you can, as I say, you've got the whole range issue with like behemoths and stuff, but basically this is almost completely ignorable. Doesn't matter how much pollution they get sent their way, they're never going to come and attack your base. Okay, so not ideal. It turns out, by chance and RNG of map generation, the groups can send just spitters or biters, which means the resultant expansion base would be exclusively worms or spawners respectively. Also, in the early game, we don't even spawn spitters, so all groups would always be 100% biters. So yes, this was the point I was making, that it's like 0.2 evolution or something, there are no spitters, so you would get no worms, which, fine, but they're meant to be the defensive turrets for the biter nests, so you're not getting that capability. But yes, and also the other way around, once the spitters are there, randomly, if you're RNG rolling each biter that can go into that expansion group, it can end up being all spitters, so you just get all worms. I mean, it could be a nice feature. Some expansions are more spawners, some are more worms, but when the map generation is a pretty consistent 50-50 split, I don't think it's worth the inconsistency. And it clashes with the prior goal of you can't tell which nests are from map generation and which are from expansions. I actually think it should come back. I'm not actually too fussed about that. Everyone looks like the map gen type of thing. So I would quite like a mod that made it weight towards one or the other depending on the type. Because I think the problem in a sense is that it was exclusive. So spitters can only become worms and biters can only become spawners. Or if you make it more that it's probabilistic, so it's a 90% chance that it's worms and it's a 90% chance that it's biters, then you can at least get a bit of variety, but they're not going to look like the early game ones. So with 2.1.14, I tweaked the definitions so it acts like 2.0. Biters and spitters can both become spawners and worms. Expansion base built alert. Even with the increased base building cooldown, it can still happen that you look away for what feels like only a moment, only to be met with an unexpected collection of pals frolicking on your doorstep. An inconvenient surprise in my 2.1.13 playtest. So yeah, basically some expansion group has turned up and is extremely close to the walls. Now that one I don't think would be a problem. If it's early game, they're not going to be any behemoths, but as I say, the real problem was that if this is a behemoth worm here or something, it can lob it at incredible distance. Way where your gun turret limit is probably there. So it can lob it way beyond and just slowly kill off your defences, basically. We could espouse the virtue of being vigilant with checking the map, but we have machines to do that for us. So we've added a new alert. If an expansion base, worm or spawner, is built in a chunk with active radar coverage, you receive the expansion base built alert. And it's this one here, basically. So it pops up in the corner here. We've got representation of the nests as the icon, and when you hover over it just shows you where that's happening. It is quite useful but also quite annoying if I'm honest, because what it actually triggers on when it says expansion base built, it doesn't mean the whole thing. It means so each of these expansions, so every time it's doing that, every time these are popping in, that it fires off a new alert, and it lasts for it makes a beep noise as well. So you can imagine if you did play it on a death world or something and they start expanding close to your walls, every 10 seconds you're going to get a beep, and considering there could be 80 trying to spawn, that's a lot of beeps. And so that would be my kind of only criticism of it, is that because it does it every time a new one spawns, and there can be 30 seconds between a spawning, it just goes beep and continues for a few seconds and then beep and continues for a few seconds. Which, if you've got something close by or you're close by, is fine. But if you're away on Falgoran, you don't actually consider it to be a problem, because if you think about it, well, for example, if your base goes up to the edge here and they start spawning bases here, who cares? And so you're going to get a beep, 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 beep as they build a thing, and you don't care. So that would be my kind of slight feedback on it. But yeah, it is a very useful feature, I would say. Caption just says, now we know. The alert only applies to chunks with active coverage, and a radar's fast scan might catch them at the right time if you're lucky. So, to wrap up, I just want to restate what we've changed to accomplish the goal of make enemy expansion nests more fun. Expansion groups are generally bigger but less frequent. That last one it didn't mention. I don't know if we've been through this all, and it didn't really mention that, which to me is like what makes it good in a sense, because what I always said, when I was doing my rants about expansion and how it's rubbish, was that it sends these tiny little groups, and what I would really prefer were bigger groups, but way less often. So, I mean, Death World, whatever, but normal game, send me a big group that expands, and if I don't catch it, or it doesn't hit my walls, or if it hits my walls, I really got struggled to take it out. But that's it. You've then got a nice period of time where nothing else happens. So it waits for a nice long time and then sends a big group. So, say across in a minute, you have a total of, say 50 biters doing expansion. I would always have much rather had, and this is what we've now got, though it's in that minute, it sends one 50 biter group. Whereas what it does at the moment is send every, 10 seconds sort of thing. Oh no, the maths on that doesn't work, but it sends 5 groups of 10 biters instead, and they colonise, and it's more frequent. But because they're all distributed around and they're tiny, they're just annoying. 50 in a clump is tough, worth doing, but don't overwhelm me with it. 10, say 5 groups of 10, annoying. Please stop. Please don't do that, because it's just annoying. Okay, so I'd say that wasn't mentioned, the less frequent. I don't think, unless I'm going mad, the less frequent wasn't mentioned, but so that's the other side to it. So we are getting all these whacking great 80 byte groups. My assumption is that the time between them also decreases essentially, so that as you go up with the evolution factor, the time between those groups comes down. It may not do, so that's the bit that's not covered in this Friday Facts. But yes, my assumption is that it does get narrower, they're closer together, but even if they aren't, sending 80 biters at once and then nothing for 2 minutes or what have you is exactly what I want. Enemy expansions are directed more toward open areas instead of thickening infested areas. So in other words, those where there's a big gap, they'll stick one in, but if there's already biters, pretty close, they don't do anything. Biter-based building is more robust and its speed is tunable. The more robust bit, I think, is referring to the code basically, and the speed is tunable means that on a Death World they can be expanding. When this group turns up, that's that bit where it's 5 seconds between them versus 10 seconds versus 30 seconds. If a biter nest is being built in your radar coverage, you will be alerted about it, and we've been fixing bugs and tweaking things based on your feedback. There's obviously no real speculation about this because it's there in the game. It's in 2.1, the experimental version, and we'll be coming to the main game. The other thing to this, it wasn't really mentioned in the changelog. There is a thing about it sort of says expansions made more accurate or something, which I don't know if that's covering this, but it's not really in the changelog. So when I started playing, and I say when I found that big expansion, early on in the game, I was like, I didn't read that in the change. What's changed here? Because they do not behave that way, and yet they were making this massive expansion base. So it's not really covered in the changelog, other than maybe that generic made it more accurate. So I say it is a bit of a hidden feature. But yes, I say from my point of view, this is a great change. I really, really like it. It does work. I think now that it's been tweaked a bit, to be a bit more softer, I think, as well. I think that's probably good for most players. But say from my point of view, I think it was in a nice place for me, who enjoys the combat before, but I appreciate, stepping it back a little bit and easing off a little bit is probably sort of better for more people. As always, let us know what you bite at the usual places. I hope you enjoyed today's Friday Facts video and might consider coming back for another one. If you want to chat about the Friday Facts, you can find me live streaming Factorio every Sunday on my Twitch channel at Tresmagistus. Thanks for watching. Cheers. Suddenly I smell chips. I don't know why I can smell chips, but I can smell chips. Where biters become bitter.